David and Rick have provided handouts for today's presentation, and I just want to draw your attention to those before we start. If you look at the right-hand column of your screen, you'll see a little box that's called Files, and there are 2 files there. And the first one in that list is titled Amalgamation Handout, and that is a Word or a rich text format of the presentation, including more details than what David and Rick will be using in the PowerPoint you'll see today. So that's a Word document. Underneath that will be the PowerPoint you'll see today with some additional details, so the longer version, so you won't need to worry about taking notes or that kind of thing. You also have the option during the webinar, if you'd like to click those and download them. You can have them to the side and be following them. You can also make the PowerPoint that you see on the screen available to you full screen. To do that, look at the top right of the PowerPoint box. You'll see a little menu. Click that and a drop-down menu appears. You can click the full screen option, and that will enable you to see the entire PowerPoint. It will fill your screen. You'll still be able to hear the presentation in the background, and not to worry, you won't be able to affect anything that's going on for any of the other participants. As many of you have already been doing, we do encourage chatting and communicating back and forth, sharing of resources. We recognize some find this distracting, but we do encourage engagement and want you to know this is not only a time to hear from our experts, our presenters, but also to share and connect with one another. So to chat, simply type your question or comment into the bar at the bottom of the chat pod and then press enter or the little bubble to the right of that bar, and that will enable your question or comment to be seen by everyone in the room. David and Rick have agreed to be watching your questions as they come in and will do their best to incorporate your questions into their presentation. I do expect with a larger group today and with the topic that we will have a number of questions, and I know David and Rick will do their best to get to as many as they can, but also that if there is anything that we aren't able to cover today or tomorrow, they are happy to talk further with you after the webinar. So I think I've covered what I need to cover. If you have any technical issues at any time, I will be available. I will go off the webcam momentarily, but will still be present on the webinar. You can message me directly by clicking the little series of lines at the top right-hand corner of the chat pod. That's another drop-down menu, and you can click that, scroll down to the option Start Chat With, and click my name or click Host. And then we'll work together to resolve your technical difficulties. So we're happy to have Rick and David here with us today to share about their joint experience working together to form the congregation today known as Kitchissippi United, which is the result of an amalgamation, and they will be sharing their experience with you. Today, Rick is working with 2 other United Church congregations in Ottawa who are preparing for an amalgamation, and David is half-time at Centertown United in Ottawa, which is the result of a recent amalgamation, and part-time Director of Faith and Arts Ottawa. So welcome, Rick and David. We're happy to have you, and I'll sign off, and
Great.
we look
Thank you,
forward to
Josephine.
what you have to share with us.
Thank you, Josephine. And just to be clear, I was working with one other person in terms of the planning and getting the Kitchissippi move going. I was one of the 2 presbytery representatives in that, and I'm now working with 2 other congregations. And David came as the one of the full-time clergy to Kitchissippi. David, do you want to say anything more about that just before we get going?
Sure, just that I came into Kitchissippi as a full-time clergy immediately after the amalgamation happened. So I was not present in the community during the process leading up to the amalgamation. although I was in the presbytery, but I was then working full-time with the Amalgamated Congregation for 2.5 years. I was there on an appointment and worked there for 2.5 years with a half-time colleague. And the Kitchissippi Amalgamation was the result of 3 founding congregations coming together. It was a 3-way amalgamation, which made conversations around the table and decision-making really, really interesting.
Quite right. The other thing, maybe just to say, as Josephine indicated, we really expect that there is going to be a lot in terms of questions. We'll do our best to get to them. We have kind of broached the idea with her, not to put her on the spot, but that there might be an opportunity at some point to open up another webinar to pick up on if there are some major questions or we can't get to a lot of things. We may see whether we can do something in the future to pick up on some of that. We've got about 30 attendees, so that's a pretty big number, and it's unlikely we'll get to all of your questions. It's really neat noticing some names I recognize and recognizing that people are here from across the country. So welcome to everybody. David, do you want to talk about, we said that our metaphor is amalgamation is marriage. Do you want to pick up that?
Yeah, I think when Rick and I were planning this webinar, we were looking for an image or a metaphor that would help us to talk constructively about the realities of amalgamation. And certainly my experience at Kitchissippi and then more recently at Centertown United working as clergy in amalgamated congregations would teach me that in many very fundamental ways, the idea that an amalgamation is a marriage is very helpful. First, that the amalgamation, I think there's been a practice in the church in the past to treat an amalgamation as something that was finished when the amalgamation ceremony took place. So the amalgamation process was a process that was a planning process leading to the moment when the founding congregations ceased to exist and the new congregation came into being, and then it was done. And that's just not true. It's no more true than to say that the wedding ceremony is the end of the process of a marriage. It is, of course, just the beginning of the process of a marriage. So in that sense, I think it helps us to see that what happens after the amalgamation ceremony is at least as important as the planning that goes beforehand. And the other is what's on the screen there for you. Every amalgamation creates a blended family. And if we think about the new church family that we're creating as a blended family, and we think about the challenges and difficulties of creating a new family unit in a marriage where there are children coming into the new family unit along with the 2 people who are marrying each other, then I think that will be very helpful to us as we go through the webinar as well.
Thanks, David. Josephine is putting up a question with some answers on the right-hand side in a poll. And maybe while we just outline what we hope to do with the webinar, maybe people might just take a moment to look at that and respond to it, and we'll be able to pick up on some of that and use it as we go along. Basically, when we were asked to do this webinar, we began planning it. We thought we were asked to do an hour, and we pushed it out to 2, and even at that, we're going to be galloping. So really, there's a whole lot of material to cover, some of it technical, and in David's case, he wants to bring in his personal perspective of what's happened while he's lived through what some of us have tried to plan. And as the saying goes, once you've finished planning, then you live it, and it's in the living that you really get to the root of what's happening. So we're going to we picked out several key issues, and we're going to be working around those. The process, leadership, and mission, vision, finance, property, governance structure, grief, transition, and timetable are kind of the outline of what we want to try and accomplish today. And as I say, we'll be hard-pressed to get to everything, and so if we seem to be talking quickly and galloping along, that's the reason. So people seem to be filling out the poll. Maybe and I can't tell whether everybody's contributed it as yet. It looks like there's still some people that haven't. So maybe we'll move to the next page. Um, and Josephine, have you've moved the poll over top of our slides?
There we go.
Okay,
That'll work.
there, just a little bit further. Okay, that's fine. Now we can change the slides. Okay, so first questions. What we want to do is talk about what do you need to be concerned about right off the bat. And one of the things that really comes to mind first is what's driving this process? Why are you even thinking about it? Is there a financial stress? Have you got declining membership? Are you looking at deteriorating buildings, massive repair bills? And have you got a real sense of where you want to go? So what is it that's driving your amalgamation desires? If it's finance, what's going on there? Have you seen declines in membership that's resulted in just fewer dollars coming in? Are you dealing with an aging congregation? Have you got a lot of people there that are just frustrated and exhausted? And that's often the case. People have got a small group of people who have been doing the same work. They've been on the same committees for years and years. They're tired, they're frustrated, they don't see an end to it. So they start looking around for, well, what can we do? And what can we do then leads us to, what other options have you got? Amalgamation isn't the be-all and end-all. It's not the single silver bullet. It's not the thing that's going to save everybody. And if what you're looking for is survival, amalgamation may not be the thing you want to do. You may want to be looking at other things. Have you looked at multi-point charges, even in an urban area? Have you looked at what physical assets you've got that might be useful to, say, another faith group? Have you had conversations with the congregation down the street that's also struggling and looking for options? Have you talked to maybe some community people who might be able to make good use of your facilities and there provide another financial base for you? Have you taken a look at what your assets are? Your physical assets, your human assets, even the contacts you've got. Surprising what will happen when you start to talk to people and they say, oh, well, I know so-and-so and we might be able to do this or that. So jumping to amalgamation isn't going to be your best move. Take a look at what other things you can do right where you are right now. And consider in that mix closing. It's painful, it's hard, and it's a really difficult conversation to have. But one of the things we need to be doing is taking a look at stewardship. And is keeping a small congregation going in the building that it's in that might be deteriorating with massive maintenance bills piling up, is that real good stewardship? And so that's one of the other options you might want to look at. I think that taking a look at amalgamation is one of the things you want to come to towards the end, after you've gone through all these other things. And that's one of the things that happened with the congregation in particular that I'm working with right now. They looked at all these other options and decided they weren't going to work for them. So they've now come to looking at amalgamation.
Rick, I'm going to jump in if I can for a minute. I want to respond to a couple of the comments that I'm seeing on the chat line. I want to acknowledge that a number of the people that are with us are working in rural settings where there may not be a lot of options for partnering with other faith groups or with other groups in the community, and that's certainly a reality. Many of us who have worked as clergy started our careers on multi-point rural charges, and we know what that's like. So there are other options for a rural setting that some places in the United Church are exploring. Regional ministries, large-scale geographical ministries with multiple staff serving several congregations. There's an experiment not too far from Ottawa here in Seaway Valley Presbytery called the Genesis Project, which is at least 5 congregations coming together with a staff team made up of ordered clergy and a number of trained lay ministers. And I think they have a website and information about what they're doing. So it's true that there are differences between urban and rural contexts, and we need to be sensitive to that. The other thing I wanted to say was that we are often pushed into amalgamation. We often feel that ending the life of a congregation and moving into something new and different is a final choice. It is in many ways a death, and we're going to be talking about grief later. But there's also the flip side of that, which is that an amalgamation can be driven, and perhaps should be driven partly, by a vision and a mission that is different, new, and larger than the founding congregations have.
Thanks, David. One of the other interesting things that's happening locally is in West Quebec, where they're just beginning to talk about bringing a number of congregations together, having a discussion around what they might be able to do, because they are also rural. Some of them are close to Ottawa. They're all small, struggling, and they also have the added dimension of how do they approach the Francophone communities in which they find themselves. How do they deal with that? So there are a lot of other ways of looking at things. I think in order to keep ourselves sort of on time, maybe we'll move to the next slide. And if people have questions around any of that introductory piece, just keep putting them in and we'll try and get to them at some point. So in terms of process, I think it's important. One of the things that David and I have been very aware of is that there are 3 partners. If you consider there being 2 congregations, the third partner, the third leg on the stool is presbytery. And the role of presbytery is rather important. Obviously, it doesn't happen unless the congregations are there, but presbytery really is there to manage the process. Having been the presbytery representative a couple of times, it's a case of being there to provide information, to provide resources, to provide linkage, and to keep the conversation going at times. It's really important that the presbytery representatives have contacts outside and beyond so that they can bring people in. For instance, when you're looking for facilitators, often it's going to be the presbytery representative that does that. So I think sometimes we think of the congregations as being the only players. The presbytery, I think, has got a real and legitimate role in that. So having said that, the other elements in the process that we've put up there are consultation and communication. Consultation, I think, one of the things that we keep trying to stress to everybody is that all voices have to be heard. And getting to people who aren't always in meetings or can't come to meetings can be a real challenge at times. You need to find ways of bringing their voice in. And it might be that you have to resort to using paper, having them contribute in some way on paper, being very flexible about when meetings occur, not just having meetings at night, because that might not be possible, it might not be convenient for people. So moving around times, moving around venues, moving around ways of getting that consultation to happen. Without it, you're really going to flounder. Often we talk about the more you communicate, the better, and it really does stand that you can't communicate often enough. It needs to be frequent, and it needs to be regular. So one of the things that we found is that when you're communicating, it needs to be the same time, the same information to everybody concerned. So that if you're dealing with 2 congregations, then it's helpful to have one communication group or one communication team so that they can then make sure that the same message is going to everybody. And you really can't tell people often enough. It's amazing how often people will say, well, you didn't, I don't remember hearing that. And then you point them to, well, at this meeting we talked about it, or you can remind them about a newsletter that went out that covered that particular point. The old saying that people hear when they're ready to hear is really true. They don't always hear what you've said. They sometimes hear what they're ready to hear when they're ready to hear it. So the more you tell them, the more often you tell them, the better. One of the other elements, I think, in this is building community. And it's really essential that you begin to get people together so that they see each other, they get to know each other, and they get to know the foibles and the strengths of all of the people that are going to be involved. In the absence of facts, people start to create information, and by getting them together so they hear the same thing at the same time, you get around some of that. Joint social events where you aren't actually doing any business, but people just have a chance to meet, greet, and get to put a face to maybe a name that they saw in some minutes. That's really an important thing to try and do. Joint newsletters, anytime you can get some word out in paper, is also really helpful. Potluck suppers, we always love to come and share food, and it's around sharing of food that we sometimes, and the hospitality involved in that we often break down some barriers. It allows us to talk about things that maybe were a little bit difficult to talk about in a more formal structure. Whenever, one of the other things that I think I'd recommend is plan to have joint or co-chairs of committees, so that that begins to bring everybody in, so that they have a sense of being part of one planning exercise, so that they aren't feeling as if one congregation is leading the important committees and the other one is leading the less important. That everybody's got a good role, got a good voice,
And Rick, I think
in what's going on.
Sorry, go ahead.
And sometimes you just need to step back. There's a time, I think, that David's comment is that there's a natural flow to the way some of this happens. So at times you don't want to meet as a whole group or as a joint group. You need to gather yourselves together and talk amongst yourselves, decide things, and have that conversation offline or in private.
Well, I was going to say exactly that. I was going to say that Rick's been emphasizing the work that needs to be done together to bring the potential partners into the same room, talking with one another, communicating to everybody the same message at the same time, doing that socially, and so on. There will be, however, times when the potentially amalgamating congregations will need to break out and go back and have conversations within themselves, because there's a whole series of decision steps, a whole series of decision points in the process, and each congregation that's involved, whether it's 2 or 3 or more, each congregation will have to make those decisions on its own, and have to work through all the hesitations and all the fears and all the particular issues that exist within their own congregation. So the process, from an overall perspective, from a presbytery perspective, needs to allow for times for the congregations to withdraw and spend time talking within their congregational circle, making decisions, deciding whether to proceed, and then coming back into the joint conversation. Without that, you wind up getting a lot of pushback because people don't feel like they've had time to make decisions on their own.
Thanks, David. I noticed that a number of comments around how can you communicate if everybody's not there on Sunday, and that's where I think talking about using paper and home visits is another David's put that up. One of the areas you might want to think about is having home or cluster groups formed so that people talk within the small groups can get together and talk in somebody's home. I noticed that looking at the poll, it looks as if 40% have indicated that they're already in discussion. So a lot of you are well into it. So it'll be interesting for us to also hear from your experience, maybe even more so tomorrow when David talks a little bit more about living the process. But those of you that have already taken steps along the path, I think it'll be really interesting for you to kick in some of your findings and experiences as well. Josephine was very generous in calling us experts. I'm always very nervous when I hear that. Having done a couple of these exercises, I'm more aware of what I don't know than what I do know.
Rick, I'm going to move us along to the next slide.
Okay.
There may be other configurations and other leaders coming in. I know we've got conference personnel ministers with us today as well, but in any amalgamation discussion, you have three sets of leadership coming from three places. You have the clergy who are in place in the congregations themselves. You have the lay leaders of the congregations, and you have the presbytery representatives, assuming that it is a presbytery that is the supervising body that is guiding the discussion. And those leaders have all need to be committed to the process of discussion. There needs to be good communication among them. There needs to be a clear understanding of what the process is, and a clear understanding of of the opportunities that people will have to buy in and to opt out, so that as decisions points have been come to that it's okay for a congregation to say, we've thought about this for a few months and we're not going to continue. That's not uncommon, and people need to be open to that. I think that the clergy need to be committed to the process, and when it is our job and our living that is on the line, that it's very hard not to be emotionally invested in the outcome. But I think as clergy, we need to recognize that this is a decision that the congregation has to make, and it is not our decision to make in any way, shape, or form. And so there are times when clergy need to show support for the process and allow the lay congregational leaders to take the lead and have honest conversations, sometimes with clergy not in the room, so that there can be an honest discussion about staffing. Presbytery representatives have a role to kind of provide that safe space, that safe container, so that these often very difficult and certainly very emotional conversations can happen, and people can express themselves without things becoming personal or people going away feeling hurt. I'm just looking at a couple of the comments that are there on the chat on the chat box. Wondering if it's best for the process to be led by clergy who are outside the circle. Donna's asking that. I think that in the case of the amalgamations we've had here in Ottawa, the presbytery representatives have been a mix of lay and clergy. The practice has been that at least one lay person and one clergy is appointed from the presbytery to help with the process, and that outside clergy and lay presence is very helpful. I think it will depend too on what the history of the clergy is. In the Kitchissippi amalgamation, 2 of the 3 congregations had clergy that were on appointments that were there to provide interim ministry, transitional ministry. The 3rd congregation had a called minister who had been in that congregation for 17 years. So very, very different dynamic when you have 2 congregations that have made a decision to move towards a different future and have moved out of the call and into an appointment process with interim ministry, and a 3rd congregation in the same conversation but with a settled minister who's been there for 17 years. And so just being aware of those dynamics, I think, is really important.
just building a little bit on what David was saying, I think in terms of the clergy, one of the things that he and I have talked about is that it really is tricky. It's a tricky role to be on the journey, to share your views, and to not be directing the traffic, to be able to step back. And I think that's tricky for any of us, to be able to provide leadership where we're able to direct it from behind, as it were, and not get in the way of people that really know where they want to go, but help them provide resources. The comment about getting outside people, in both of the cases, the situations that I've been involved in, we've used outside resources for various parts of it. I'll talk a little bit more when we get to the mission piece, because I think having somebody come in and work with, facilitate the groups, provide a neutral voice and are able to say some things to maybe challenge and push people where some of those that are regularly involved couldn't do that. And sometimes that's the role also of the presbytery representatives, to make sure that everybody's voice is being heard, and to, again, raise some of the questions that maybe people were reluctant to raise, to get in there and ask some of the more difficult questions that people are dodging, to be that conscience. So I think we'll try and we'll move to the next, which is, in fact, the mission and vision piece. And one of the things that I've come across is a document that's coming out of the Presbyterian Church USA. In the United Church, we talk about, and this comes under the heading there, different understandings of amalgamation. One of the things that I think is useful coming out of the Presbyterian work is that they take amalgamation and split it three ways. What they're saying is that if you've got equal partners, if you've got two or three congregations, equal size, equal revenue streams, equal asset bases, then what you might consider that to be a true amalgamation. You might find yourself dealing with a couple of congregations that say, what we want to do is come together to do some specific work. And what the Presbyterians do is they consider that to be a merger. Their third leg is what they call assimilation. And one of the things that makes that one different, and I think this maybe is becoming more and more something we're seeing, it's where you've got one very strong congregation and a congregation that has maybe fewer assets, fewer people, an older congregation that is more tired, more frustrated. We've chosen to call that one adoption. And in that model, the receiving congregation takes in, as it were, the joining congregation. And what we're saying with that, and the way we're handling that one here, is to say, in that case, the rules around, for instance, staff having to back away, not being part of the eventual amalgamated congregation, won't apply. It gets us out of that box of having to worry about that particular aspect. In this case, we're also saying that the joining congregation knows up front that they're going to go to the building, the property that the receiving congregation already has. It means that probably there won't be a huge discussion around name. It means there won't be a big discussion around structure, governance. So what we're finding is that this is making that particular, quote, amalgamation a lot easier to handle, to sell, and to work through presbytery. So just to keep that in mind, it's an area that I've found very useful to work with, and is maybe a little different to the way we've traditionally looked at amalgamations.
Yeah, I was just going
David?
to chime in here and say that and shift the conversation a little bit to the discussion about creating a new mission and a new vision. So if you want to finish up what you were saying, Rick, that's fine. Well, just
Okay,
to
no,
say
that's
that
where I was
we
headed, so
began
go
we
ahead.
began the PowerPoint presentation. We began the webinar with the question: what is driving this process? What's driving the conversation? A lot of the things that drive the conversation are things that push us. They're the difficult circumstances that churches find themselves in. But I think in the case of a full amalgamation where everything is on the table, including what to do with property, what to call the new ministry, and what the mission and ministry itself will be, I think you have the opportunity at this point to create something that will draw, that will pull people into the amalgamation. So instead of being pushed reluctantly into a forced marriage, you have the opportunity to create a set of circumstances that for at least some people in the congregations will engage them and fire their enthusiasm, ignite their creativity, and help to make it look less like an arranged marriage and a forced marriage and more like something that they want to get into because it's actually going to make for a richer and a deeper life together. And I think that that part of the process is critical. In the second half of the conversation, we talk about living the amalgamation. If you've got something to live for and something positive to live into, then it makes it a lot. It gives you a reason to get over the grief of losing the familiar. And that's something that is really, really an important part of the conversation after the amalgamation ceremony happens. So there are ways to do all of that, and many of you are probably very experienced at missioning and visioning the kinds of processes and conversations you need to have in order to make that happen. As Rick was saying, in some of the understandings of amalgamation with slightly different names, this isn't as important because you're not creating a new mission, you're welcoming a small group into a larger group that already has a healthy mission. But if you really are looking at an amalgamation of equals, then this step of trying to articulate why are we doing this beyond just we're doing it because we have to. If you're only doing it because you have to, then maybe you need to look at a different option, including the option of allowing a congregation to die gracefully, close the building, close the ministry, disperse the assets to enable new ministry, and have the presbytery help the congregants find new church homes for themselves in places that are good for them. And that's something that can happen perhaps more easily in an urban setting than in a rural setting, but I think it's something we don't look at, perhaps when we should. If an amalgamation process, it becomes clear in the planning stages that there isn't a will to create a vibrant new vision and mission, then perhaps it really is time to say goodbye and allow a chapter of church history to close with dignity and allow for the remaining assets of the ministry to be dispersed in a way that allows new ministry to emerge somewhere else.
Thanks, David. Stephen asking a question about more information on those models. I'll try and find. It was one of those where I Googled and wandered down several lanes. There was a document on the Presbytery USA website called "And the Two Shall Become One: A Resource for Church Mergers." By tomorrow, I'll try and find out where my string led me and how I got to that particular piece, but that's the title of the document. If you probably Googled it in the Presbytery website, you'd be able to find that document along with some others. Just picking up on what David's saying, the item that we have there, what makes you tick and how to identify it, this is probably another area where you want to look at outside resources. Again, people who are maybe specialists in working with congregations to lead them through that kind of visioning work. And as David said, if you haven't got that in place, then it's a forced marriage, and people are not going to, you're not going to have the vitality that you really need to carry yourself through it. We talked about, David and I had talked about a life ring. throwing a life ring, and the fact that amalgamation is not, in fact, a life ring. It won't save two struggling congregations. What it might do is drag both of them down, and you'll wind up with one struggling congregation in the place of two. So just to keep that in mind, unless it's mission-based, unless what you're doing is developing, thank you, Josephine, unless you're developing a real sense of where you're going and what you want to be in the next 5-10 years, it really is not going
Sandra
to work
asks
for
a
you.
good question about what if one congregation is larger than the other, so they're not equal, but the vision really is to create new ministry together, as the current ministry at even the larger church is not adequate. So they're not looking for status quo. They're not looking for just more people. They're looking for real change. Then the discussion around the new mission and the new vision should go forward. What we're offering here, of course, are generalizations based on our own experience. But I would say that you would go forward conscious of the fact that after the merger, after the amalgamation has happened, you need conscious of how you are going to continue to hear the minority voice within the new structure, and how will you enable the desires and the wishes of the smaller congregation to continue to be heard once there's one group voting and the larger congregation perhaps is in the majority.
Okay, we've got maybe about just around 20 minutes left, so I think, as I say, we're going to do a lot of galloping. So I think that particular slide really does beg to have a lot more conversation, but in order to get through what we want to get through today, maybe we'll move along. And if there's time, we can maybe work that piece a little further. Finance, in terms of planning, it's essential that everybody knows what the books look like. There needs to be full disclosure. You need to have everybody's, if there's more than two parties involved, you need to have everybody's books open, and there can't be surprises. When you're looking at, for instance, memorial gifts, memorial funds, everybody has to know whether or not there were strings attached to them, what the strings were, and when they get folded together, how's that going to work? That's the kind of conversation you really need to have. And if you can't pull that together, if you can't get the finances together, you're going to be leaving yourselves wide open for a lot of surprises that are going to be rather nasty, I think, down the road. All sorts of, a number of things to just keep in mind, practical things like envelopes, and if you're meeting together, what are you going to do in terms of envelopes? Are you going to, how are you going to split the envelopes to make sure that everybody gets what goes to the right congregation? Because really encourage people to worship together through the process at different times. But the money at this point needs to go back to their own congregation. How are you going to close the old books? What's the process you're going to use? Who are you going to bring in to be your auditor? What sort of auditing process are you going to use? How are you going to do your budgeting? You're going to need to think about a budget for the coming year the year while you're discussing amalgamation. You need to have a budget as you move into the amalgamation process or the amalgamation group, so that when you are together finally as a single congregation, you've got a starting budget. So you need people together to talk about that. How are you going to handle PAR? How are you going to move people around there? Your Canada Revenue Agency, your number needs to be dealt with. How are you going to handle tax receipts for the last year, for future years? Who's doing what? Who are going to be signing officers, both during the transition and afterwards? How are you going to decide who are your signing officers? You've got to notify financial institutions and suppliers about the change of name and whatever else you've got, contact. Memorial gifts, to say, think about what's going to happen there. And above all, in terms of your budgeting, be realistic. You aren't going to have everybody come with you. Sorry, it's not going to happen. So when you're doing your budget for the amalgamated congregation, keep in mind, you aren't going to have everybody from both or three congregations joining you. David, anything else that you want to
I think you've
add to that?
You've really pointed out, Rick, that there's just a lot of details involved in this, and this is a discussion that happens later in the process. If there's a commitment to amalgamation, all of those specific things that Rick mentioned are really important. And I would add that my experience has been working in two different amalgamated congregations, that the finances of congregations that are leading into amalgamation are often in disarray, and that the information that Rick is talking about often is difficult to find. Things like trust funds and memorial funds are often not well known, and may have been given years ago, and the people who knew the circumstances of the gifts may no longer be around. And part of the fatigue of congregations that are looking at amalgamations is that their finances their financial records are not in good shape. And that was a huge issue at Kitchissippi United Church in the first year after the amalgamation, because it took months and months to close the books of the amalgamating congregations, because new stuff kept showing up unexpectedly, and some of the surprises were pleasant and some weren't. So it's just something to consider. I think we should move on to property.
Yep. Okay. This is probably going to be, for some, this is a real interesting piece. We really are wedded to talking the marriage analogy, we are wedded in a lot of ways to our building. And as soon as we talk about selling a building, it just opens up a real hornet's nest. But if you've got, part of the reason for amalgamating probably is at least one of you has a building that is either not up to code, or has got huge maintenance to do, isn't accessible, can't be made accessible. So all of those things start to play on what are you going to do with the existing property. On the slide it says what is on the table, and it really has to be everything. Everything needs to be open for discussion. You need to be able to talk about what are we going to do with not just the big building, but all the little things that are inside it. How are we going to handle all the memorials that were there, the windows, the memorial plaques, the communion tables? What are we going to do with the surplus pieces? How are we going to dispose of them? Are you going to have an auction? Are you going to invite other congregations to come and take a look around? Are you going to have kind of a garage sale? All of those things need to be thought through in terms of what are you going to do with the smaller pieces of property. A couple of cautions around the actual buildings. You need to remember in terms of the buildings that, well, various presbyteries handle things differently, but the money will go with the congregation, but you have to have a very specific and detailed disposal plan that will go to presbytery for approval. So if you're selling property, make sure that you take that into consideration. Presbytery is going to be looking for it. In fact, will demand it.
Rick, can I interrupt for a moment? Because what you're saying about having a plan, there's a question up on the chat pod there about properties that have circumstances which makes it very difficult to sell them. There's a property, for example, that has a graveyard around it. So with a cemetery on the property with the church, you can't sell that to be redeveloped. The cemetery means that the property can't be used for any other purpose. That's not going to be uncommon, and there are other circumstances. Kitchissippi or Centertown United Church, where I work now, the building that we're in has an apartment building attached to it. I mean, physically attached to the building on the same property that was built a number of decades ago, with a long-term lease to the person who built the apartment building. So there's a very complicated leasing arrangement for that part of the property, which makes disposing of the property quite complicated. And I don't have an easy question either an easy answer to the question about properties that have those kinds of very limiting and constraining circumstances. That's where I think we would look for help. From the national church, from our conferences, from real estate agents and so on in our communities, because church buildings are not like other properties. In many cases, particularly in cities, there are also heritage issues and heritage designations which limit what you can do with the buildings. So that's a big, big issue, and that is those kinds of issues are part of the discussion around property.
And this is probably one of the places where you really want to get close with your presbytery property people. These are people who have usually had experience with dealing with all sorts of property issues. So early on, you probably want to make contact with them, invite them in to the discussion, so that you can take advantage of their knowledge and their wisdom. In some cases, I know with Kitchissippi, for instance, we wanted to know how much the properties, because there were 3 of them, were valued. So there was a process where we went to 5 different realtors and asked them to give us an appraisal. In the group that I'm working with now, they decided not to do that, but rather to go to they opened it up to developers and faith groups and said, okay, if we're making this available, give us your best bid. The feeling was that we had a good sense of what the property was worth, and so we didn't go and try and find appraisals. But for the peace of mind of the people that are going to be in the amalgamated congregation, it's probably a good idea to have some kind of an assessment made of all the buildings, so that you've got an idea of which buildings are more likely to require work afterwards. Which one is going to require retrofitting for handicap? Which one's got if kitchen and gathering is important, which one has got the best kitchen? What's going to be important to you in the buildings? So having people work that kind of thing through, knowing what your mission is, will determine which property and how you want to use that property. So it goes back again to the whole piece around mission. Just very quickly, a couple of other things around property. David mentioned about leases with Centertown. You need to know who you've got leases with, and sometimes it's a bit of a surprise. Somebody will say, oh yeah, we've been renting our parking lot to so-and-so, and nobody else was quite aware of that. So all those leases need to be tied up. If you're renting to a group that comes in once a month, you've got to figure out who they are and how you tie that up. What are you going to do with your, in terms of leases around photocopying equipment, your website, who your servers are? All those funny little things that we just sort of take for granted. Somebody's got to identify every one of them and have a plan for what you're going to do with them.
I think, Rick, we've got less than 10 minutes left, Rick, and we've got still, I think, 3 slides we want to get through. So maybe we'll just go through them quickly. Stephen has just put up a good question, though. We're a very healthy congregation with a building that requires more than $1 million in work. We are currently looking at redevelopment options as well as amalgamation. Is that a helpful tension? And my response would be yes. I think that would allow. That puts a couple of very different options on the table, and it will allow the congregation to really discern whether it wants to try to go forward on its own with the redevelopment and find partners to do that, or whether it wants to move away from a building that is more expensive than they can maintain and find another faith home within a congregation. But let's move on into our last few slides and go through them fairly quickly.
Yeah. Okay, just in terms of that, there's some really interesting stuff that I think Kelowna is doing in terms of redevelopment. You might want to take a look at what they're up to. Governance, let's just say that you need to take a look at what's your structure now. Are you a council, or are you one of the remaining steward session congregations, and what do you want to have in the future? Don't forget, you're going to need to put together, if you're coming together, you're going to need a new constitution. That's going to have to be approved through the presbytery, and you need to get the body within the presbytery that's going to be looking at it involved with you early on, so that you don't fall into a pit somewhere and then have them turn down your proposal.
I realize you can't really make out the graphic that's there on the page very well, but it's just there to say that the governance and structure issue is complicated and can have a lot of steps and stages to it. I think the key one is, though, the final question on the slide there. Does the proposed vision and mission entail a new governance structure? Or to flip that around, does the new governance structure flow out of the new mission and the new vision? When we talk about creating a new faith community, the governance structure and the way we organize ourselves is at least as important in terms of how that will actually be lived out as the building we're in, as the way we worship, and as what we say our mission is.
And I think under this rubric, we also wanted to just very quickly touch on things like staff, remembering that incumbent personnel, ministry personnel that have an existing call can't be extended or appointed. So there are some things around our own polity that you need to be aware of in terms of how we handle staff. And as you go into that process, just be mindful that the whole governance thing has got a lot of small subsets to it that we aren't going to get to today.
Yeah, our last couple of slides. This is an important topic, and one that we'll be talking more about tomorrow as well. As you move into amalgamation, you need to think in terms of both lasts and firsts. The last Christmas, the last Thanksgiving, the last baptism, the last wedding, the final worship service, the last anniversary service, all of those kinds of things, including the things that are of particular importance to the local congregation. If there are special Sundays in the year that are marked by the local congregation that aren't part of the broader Christian calendar, you need to take note of that. Planning the firsts then is the flip side of that. The first joint worship, the first decision towards amalgamation, and so on. The picture there simply is the mixing of multicolored sand is a common ritual in a marriage where there is a blending of families, and you get that wonderful multicolored sand by taking the green and the blue and putting it together, and that's the process. Go ahead, Rick.
And then, and very briefly, I know David will talk a lot more about it tomorrow, but planning for grief. This is a death, and let's not fool ourselves. It's a loss, it's an ending, and we need to plan for that. The grieving will go on, and so planning for it, and part of that is planning those lasts, but giving people hope, saying, here, we're going to have these first. Here are where we're going to celebrate. So moving through that. And I think very quickly, our last slide is around timetable. Why the rush? Try and take a breath every now and then. This is change, and it's really gut-wrenching change. So give yourself enough time. I think most of the exercises, most times people will say you're looking at certainly a year, and probably 2 years from start to finish. Don't try and make a quarter-mile gallop. I think you need to take the time. Everybody's got to get in there. Everybody has to be heard, and that
that
takes
ending
time.
on that note, I noticed that we're into
So,
our final 60 seconds here, and we know that there is another meeting planned in this meeting space at 3 o'clock. So we're going to have to really honor that. And here's Josephine back with us.
Thanks, David and Rick, for that overview. Wow, there's a lot to cover, isn't there? It's a lot of good material for us to think about. And we look forward to coming back tomorrow and hearing the rest of the story and the work that goes into an amalgamation after it's happened. Just a quick reminder that this webinar
Josephine,
is
just quickly,
being recorded and will be available as a
someone is
recorded
asking if
version
they can get
after
the
5 o'clock
slides.
today.
Can
So
you
if
just
you know
quickly tell
anyone
people how to
that's planning
download?
to join us tomorrow, they can catch up the first half tonight or tomorrow morning. And we will give you the feedback forms tomorrow after we've finished both sessions. Thank you so much for being an engaging audience, and thank you, Rick and David, and we will see you all tomorrow. Sure, yes, thanks for that reminder. At the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a little files box, and there are 2 files there, and actually the PowerPoint that we've been looking at is a shorter version than the one that
Thanks,
you'll be able
Josephine.
to
Thanks,
download,
everybody.
so you'll have
Hope to have
access
you
to a
all back
lot more
here
of what
at 2 o'clock
David and
tomorrow.
Rick have been sharing
thank you.
with us. The first of those 2 files is a
Bye-bye.
handout. It's a Word,
Thank you.
an
Bye-bye.
RTF version of the presentation.